Welcome to Whispers of History, where forgotten tales, strange events, and mysterious moments from the past come alive. One whisper at a time. Subscribe, relax, and let the past whisper you to sleep. In the quiet stillness before sunrise, the streets of Florence were already stained with whispers, of blood, of miracles, of madness. In this world, pain was not a problem to be solved, but a doorway to the divine. Or to death. Surgery was not science, it was survival, and it rarely ended well. There were no sterile gloves. No anesthesia. No antiseptic. Only rough wooden tables, rusted metal, and a faith in four invisible fluids called humors. You didn't ask if a surgery would hurt, you prayed you'd live through the hurt long enough to limp home. This was a time when genius and guesswork shared the same scalpel. When artists painted anatomy from stolen corpses. When your neighborhood barber could shave your chin. Or saw off your leg. In the following stories, we walk through 10 moments where life, death, and medicine met with bare hands. You will see why, for all its splendor and brilliance, the Renaissance was not a world the modern body, or mind, was built to survive. Let's go back in time to Florence, Italy. The year is 1495, you're not royalty. You're not rich. You're just an ordinary person who works with your hands, maybe in the market, or maybe loading carts in the busy streets. One day, you get injured. A deep cut on your leg, maybe from a splintered wagon wheel or a rusty nail. At first, you think it's nothing. But a few days later, your leg is swollen, burning hot, and turning a disturbing shade of purple. There's no hospital to rush to. No emergency hotline. You're not calling for an ambulance. What you do have is the local barber surgeon, a man who might have shaved someone's beard earlier that morning, and who is now preparing to amputate your leg. Yes. That's how it worked. Barber surgeons weren't just trimming beards and chatting with locals. They were the go-to medical men for everything from tooth pulling to bloodletting to full-blown amputations. They had tools. They had assistants. They had experience, sort of. What they didn't have was much science. You're taken to his surgery room, which isn't what we'd call a medical room today. It's more like a dim, stone-walled chamber behind his shop. There's no clean white light. No sterile bed. Just the thick smell of sweat, herbs, and something metallic that makes your stomach turn. A flickering oil lamp casts shadows across the walls. The floor is uneven, old stone, and as your eyes adjust, you notice that it's wet. Red and brown stains mark where others have stood. Or fallen. At the center of the room is a table, waist-high, made of rough oak. It's worn, scratched, and stained dark in places. Not from varnish, from blood. The barber surgeon greets you with a glance. He's busy. He's already seen 2 other patients today. One had a crushed hand. Another, an infected jaw. Neither left looking better. You're asked to lie on the table. 2 young boys, maybe apprentices, help guide you. Their aprons are streaked with red. You sit, hesitating. Then you lie down. The surgeon examines your leg. He doesn't wear gloves. He presses gently, and you scream in pain. He nods grimly. It must come off, he says. Just like that, you're offered a leather strap to bite on. That's your pain relief. There's no anesthesia. Ether hasn't been discovered yet. Opium is rare and expensive. No morphine. No numbing injections. Just your teeth, your courage, and a couple of people to hold you still. 2 assistants grab your arms. One climbs on top of your chest to keep you down. The barber surgeon lifts a saw from the table, it's heavy, rusted, and looks more like something you'd use to cut firewood than flesh. It hasn't been cleaned beyond a quick wipe on a cloth that's already soaked with blood. He tightens a leather strap around your thigh, just above the knee. It's to slow the bleeding. Hopefully, you bite down hard. The saw touches your skin. And then, he starts. The pain is instant and overwhelming. There's no slow build-up. It's just there, everywhere, all at once. The blade tears through skin, then muscle, then finally bone. You scream. Your body jerks, but the boys hold you down. You smell your own blood. You feel your nerves cry out, there's a sickening crunch. That's the bone, you're still awake. Still aware. You try to go somewhere else in your mind, a field, a memory, anything but here, but the pain yanks you back. You're sweating, trembling. Sobbing, finally, it's done, the leg is gone. Just gone, you're pale, shaking, barely conscious. The stump is bleeding fast. The surgeon grabs a hot iron rod from the fire. Without warning, he presses it against the wound. The sizzling sound fills the room. The smell is worse than anything, like burnt meat and wet cloth. You don't remember the next few minutes. Maybe you passed out. Maybe you just don't want to remember. When you wake, the stump is bandaged with strips of linen soaked in wine and honey, the best disinfectant they have. The bleeding has slowed. But the fever has begun. Your body is fighting an infection already. And it doesn't have much of a chance, you're told to rest. They send you home, on a cart or carried by friends. There's no follow-up appointment. No antibiotics. No x-rays. No sterile environment waiting for you, you'll spend the next few days in bed. If you're lucky, the fever will break. If you're not, the infection will spread. The stump will turn black. Your breathing will become shallow. And then, nothing. In 1495, even surviving the surgery wasn't enough. The truth is, most people didn't. Between blood loss, shock, and sepsis, many died within days of a procedure. And the ones who lived? They lived with pain, trauma, and a very real fear of ever needing treatment again. Today, we expect comfort, care, and clean spaces. But in the Renaissance, medicine was brutal, messy, and deeply misunderstood. This is why you wouldn't last in a Renaissance surgery room. Let's say you survived the surgery, somehow, the bleeding stopped. The fever calmed. You're still alive. You wake in a small room with candlelight flickering on the stone walls, your leg wrapped in wine-soaked linen, your body sore but present. You think you've made it. But now comes the second part of recovery, the part where the barber surgeon, or perhaps a traveling physician, begins to balance your humors. See, medicine in 1495 wasn't based on cells, bacteria, or science as we know it. It was rooted in an ancient idea, one passed down from the Greeks and Romans, the theory of the four humors. According to this idea, your body was governed by four main fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant keeping all four in perfect balance. Illness? That meant one of them was too strong, too dominant, and had to be removed. So now, lying weak after surgery, your physician leans over you and says, "We must bleed you." You try to protest, but this is considered real treatment. And bleeding isn't just for big injuries. People were bled for headaches, for colds, for sadness, for fevers, and even just to stay healthy. You're given a bowl to hold. A linen cloth is tied around your arm. The physician reaches for a small case, a polished wooden box that opens to reveal sharp, shining tools. Not antiseptic. Not new. Just sharp. He selects a lancet, a small knife used to cut open a vein. He presses along your arm, finds a spot, and makes the cut. You feel the warmth of blood before you see it. It pours into the bowl. Slowly at first, then faster. You're told this will rebalance your system. You're told you'll feel lighter, but you already feel dizzy, not from healing, but from losing more of the very thing keeping you alive. If bloodletting isn't enough, there's another option: purgatives. These are powerful herbal concoctions designed to purge the body. In other words, they make you vomit. Or they make everything exit quickly from the other end. You're handed a cup, bitter, dark, and thick. It smells like old bark and ash. You're told to drink. Within the hour, you're sweating. Your stomach turns. You spend the next few hours near a chamber pot or over a bucket, losing everything: fluids, energy, willpower, all in the name of balance. And still, this was normal. Even kings and queens were bled and purged. Royal physicians would carefully track which humors were rising and apply leeches or prescribe strange mixtures, sometimes made with mercury, or boiled frogs, or crushed emeralds. A wealthy patient might have elegant tools, silver bowls, crystal vials, and golden tweezers. A commoner like you'd have rusty blades and wooden cups, but the treatment was the same. And the risk just as high: bloodletting weakened the body. Purgatives drained the system. Both left you vulnerable to infection, collapse, and long-term damage, if the surgery didn't break you. The cure might: imagine having the flu, and instead of rest, water, and medicine, you're told to vomit for days, to bleed into a bowl, or to swallow ash and vinegar. Now think, how long would you last? Today, we understand infection. We have antibiotics. 4 drips. Safe hydration. Back then, you'd be lucky to find clean water, let alone anything sterile. The body, already fragile after trauma or illness, was pushed further by treatments meant to help, but often made things worse. You weren't healing. You were surviving. If your humors didn't rebalance, the next step might be even stranger: drilling a hole in your skull, applying heated cups to your back, or burying you up to your neck in mud. Yes, those were real treatments. And all of them, like bleeding and purging, came from one idea: that your body needed to be cleansed, not cared for. The Renaissance was a time of beauty and rebirth. But for the average person, medicine was still a mix of myth, guesswork, and ritual. So when you wonder why you wouldn't last in 1495, it's not just the surgeries, it's the cures. Imagine you're in a dark, smoky room. The walls are stone, and there's a strange mix of incense and rot in the air. You lie flat on a wooden board, straw poking your skin, with a dull ache in your head that has never gone away. A man in a robe, smelling faintly of wine and herbs, leans over you, holding a drill. Not a modern drill, a hand-cranked thing that squeaks as it turns. You're about to experience trepanation, the ancient, terrifying art of drilling holes in the human skull. Back in 1495, if you had seizures, migraines, or what we might now call mental illness, trepanation might be your only cure. Doctors believed drilling a hole in your skull would release bad spirits or rebalance your humors. And though the procedure sometimes worked, by reducing pressure in the brain, it was less science and more guesswork. The idea behind trepanation goes back thousands of years. Skulls from prehistoric times have been found with small, neatly bored holes. Some even showed signs of healing. By the Renaissance, the practice was still alive, often done in monasteries, battlefield tents, or back-alley medical shops. And shockingly, people survived it. Sometimes, let's walk through it, together. You wouldn't be given anesthesia. That wasn't invented yet. Maybe someone would hand you a stick to bite. Or a bit of wine. You'd be held down by assistants, strong ones. Then, the barber surgeon would shave your head with a dull razor and scrub your scalp with a cloth soaked in vinegar or urine. Thought to clean the wound. It stung, badly. Next came the incision. With a small, curved blade, the surgeon would cut a flap of your scalp and peel it back to reveal the bone. Blood would pour down your face. Then he'd pick up his trepan, a hand-cranked tool with a sharp, circular blade. He placed the tip at the center of your forehead, just above the eyes, and began to turn. Slowly. Carefully. Squeak. Squeak. The sound was worse than the pain, at first. You might feel pressure. Vibration. Then, a deep, splitting pain as the blade bit deeper. Your head shook with each crank. Sometimes the surgeon stopped to let you breathe. But the worst part? You were awake through it all. Sometimes, bone dust clogged the blade. He'd scrape it clean. Sometimes, the tool slipped. And if he went too deep, it could cut into your brain. But if all went well, he'd remove a small disc of bone and place it in a cloth. He might even show it to you. Then came the closing. The skin was stitched loosely with gut thread or left open to drain. No antibiotics. No painkillers. No bandages like we know them. Only time. Some people lived. Some got infections. Others died right there on the table. Why go through this? Because it sometimes helped. People with swelling in the brain, bleeding inside the skull, or intense pressure could feel relief afterward. It was a brutal, medieval version of what we now call decompression surgery, but the survival rate? Questionable. And even if you survived the operation, the aftercare was minimal. You might be sent home to recover on a straw mattress, your open wound exposed to flies, dust, and damp air. This is why you wouldn't last a day in the surgery rooms of the past. Modern medicine has made pain rare, infection preventable, and brain surgery incredibly precise. Back then, it was a mixture of desperation and luck. Still, trepanation tells us something strange and wonderful. Humans have always tried to heal. Even when the tools were crude and the theories wrong, there was hope behind every hole in the head. Picture this: you're lying on a cot, your head bandaged from a recent trepanation. The pain is dull but ever present, and you pray for anything that might help. A man strides into the smoky room, not in the flowing robes of a priest or the armor of a knight, but in rough traveler's clothes, smelling of sulfur, ink, and river mud. He speaks fast, his eyes alight with strange ideas, clutching a leather satchel stuffed with herbs, powders, and small vials. You've just met Paracelsus, the physician alchemist who broke every rule of medicine in his time. He wasn't your average doctor. Born Theophrastus von Hohenheim in 1493, Paracelsus believed healing wasn't about bleeding patients or balancing humors. He rejected the teachings of Galen, the Roman authority whose dusty doctrines had ruled for 1,300 years. Paracelsus insisted that diseases came from the outside world, not just inner imbalance. In short, your headache might be from a poison, not from bad air or sin. Radical stuff. Paracelsus traveled across Europe on foot, learning from miners, herbalists, and mystics. He saw how mercury poisoned the lungs of metalworkers. He studied wounds from swords and cannonballs. And he didn't just observe, he experimented. He crushed minerals into powders, infused plants into tinctures, and gave his patients chemicals, not prayers, one of his most famous concoctions. Laudanum, an opium-based painkiller that, in small doses, soothed suffering. It wasn't perfect, but in a world where trepanation was done with no anesthetic, it was something. Imagine him at your bedside after surgery. He doesn't chant a blessing or apply leeches. Instead, he rubs a paste of crushed minerals on your wound, muttering about chemical balances and nature's signatures. He might light incense not to chase off spirits, but to cleanse the air of infection. In your haze, you wonder if he's a genius or a madman. He once burned Galen's medical books in public. He was kicked out of universities, scorned by professors, and followed by rumors of magic. But his results spoke loudly. He treated patients that others gave up on. And unlike many doctors of his time, he believed in observing the individual patient, not just fitting them into an ancient theory. Still, his medicine was risky. Mercury, arsenic, sulfur, these were part of his toolkit. He believed the right dose could cure what the wrong dose would kill. He called it the doctrine of signatures, the idea that God marked cures into the shapes and colors of nature. A yellow flower might heal jaundice, a red root might help blood disorders. His ideas laid the foundation for toxicology and modern pharmacology. He invented the concept that the dose makes the poison, but don't get too romantic. His treatments could still be deadly. Without exact measurements or an understanding of long-term effects, many of his patients suffered new ailments, or never woke up at all, and yet, Paracelsus represented something new. He believed medicine should evolve. That doctors should experiment, not just follow. That suffering could be soothed not with faith alone, but with science and chemistry, so why wouldn't you last a day in his world? Because you'd be his experiment. There were no clinical trials, no consent forms. If you lived, it proved a theory. If you died, it taught a lesson. Your pain might be soothed by a drop of opium, or worsened by a smear of mercury. You were part of the lab, and if you questioned him, he might quote the stars, the Bible, or some half-burned manuscript he found on his travels. His medicine was brilliant, dangerous, and deeply personal, but in that messy, alchemical chaos, modern science found its first spark. Let's say you're a curious medical student in the year 1510. You've read the old anatomy scrolls. Some say the liver makes thoughts, others claim the brain is just a sponge to keep your head cool. Confused yet? Good. That's why you need to see the truth for yourself. And that means you need a human body, but here's the problem: dissecting cadavers in this era isn't just rare, it's scandalous, illegal in most cities, and feared by the public. The church frowns upon it. Families forbid it. Authorities regulate it. And yet, without real bodies to study, how can anyone understand how to save lives? This is where things turn dark. This was the beginning of the underground cadaver trade. Yes, body snatching was real. Students and surgeons desperate for knowledge turned to the shadows, hiring grave robbers, bribing guards, even digging up the dead themselves. The targets were often the poor, the unclaimed, or criminals, those least likely to be noticed when their bodies vanished in the night. It was gruesome, risky, and illegal. But to the anatomist, it was a sacred opportunity, and when a cadaver did arrive, usually under candlelight, covered in cloth and silence, it became a moment of revelation. Dissections weren't quiet academic affairs. They were public spectacles. People gathered in anatomy theaters not just to learn, but to gawk. The body was posed, limbs arranged like a sculpture. The cuts were slow, deliberate, almost theatrical. It often took days to complete a full dissection. The body, naturally, began to decay. Perfumed cloths were draped nearby to fight the stench, but nothing could stop time. It was a race between knowledge and rot. There were no formal gloves, no antiseptics, no refrigeration. The surgeons worked barehanded or with crude tools, and infections were common. Still, this was the only way to discover the human blueprint, and to correct centuries of error. For instance, many still believed in Galen's anatomy, a Roman physician who never dissected a human, only apes and pigs. His texts ruled medicine for over 1,000 years. But now, with fresh human tissue before them, students saw how wrong he had been. The jaw was in one piece, not two. The liver had 5 lobes, not 7. The heart had chambers, not just a single hollow room. It was like unlearning everything you thought you knew, and yet. Dissection didn't mean understanding. They didn't know why the organs worked the way they did. Blood circulation wasn't discovered until decades later. Many believed the body was ruled by humors, invisible fluids that needed balancing. Still, each cut brought medicine one step closer to the truth. But it came at a cost. The dead had no peace, and the living faced ethical storms. Some cities responded by offering executed criminals for dissection. It was seen as a final punishment, to have your body cut up in front of a crowd, your name forever associated with decay. In time, the demand outpaced the supply. That's when people turned to fresh graves, stealing bodies just hours after burial. Entire networks were formed. Some apothecaries, midwives, and even undertakers were in on the scheme. In major cities like Bologna, Padua, and Edinburgh, the line between learning and crime blurred completely, but to the surgeon, it was a necessary evil. Without it, how else could they learn to cut safely? Or to find the liver without getting lost in a mess of tissue and fat? Surgery, already brutal and short on time, was often improvised in the moment. Anatomy gave them a fighting chance. Still, it was far from safe. Surgeons lacked proper understanding of nerves, infection, and blood loss. They might slice into an artery by accident. They didn't sterilize blades. Anesthesia wouldn't come for 300 more years, so even with better anatomy knowledge, surgery remained an ordeal of screams, speed, and survival. As for the cadavers, their journey didn't always end with one lesson. They were sometimes reused, stitched up and reopened by class after class, until there was little left to study. Bones were boiled clean. Organs dried out. The rest quietly buried, or burned, and though these bodies were silenced in life, they spoke volumes in death. Thanks to them, the next generation of healers had a slightly clearer path forward. But if you're wondering whether you would survive surgery in this era, the answer is still likely no. Despite growing anatomical knowledge, the tools remained crude, the procedures violent, and the hygiene horrifying. A misjudged incision, a dirty hand, a misunderstanding of blood flow, all could be fatal. And let's not forget, many surgeons were still barbers who learned their craft through apprenticeship and luck. Today, we take for granted the sterile or, the MRI scan, the pain meds. But every clean incision, every safe operation, stands on the shoulders of those who risked their reputations, and cadavers who gave their final gift. Back then, knowledge came at a high cost. And sometimes, the body had to vanish just to be seen. The year is 1650, and your street smells of smoke, damp earth, and fear. The plague has been visiting your city for months now, taking neighbors, friends, and strangers alike. You've been feeling weak for days, a deep ache in your bones, a strange burning in your throat. Your family whispers in the kitchen, but you hear the truth in their tone. The plague is here. And it might have chosen you next. Then, faint at first but growing louder, you hear the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on the cobblestones. The sound of the plague doctor arriving. He turns the corner into view, a tall figure in a long, black leather coat, gloved hands, and a wide-brimmed hat. But it's his mask that makes your chest tighten, a long, Curved beak like a giant bird's face, glass eye lenses reflecting the dim afternoon light. Inside the mask's beak are herbs, flowers, and spices, rosemary, lavender, cloves, all meant to purify the air. He believes this will keep him safe from the disease, but in truth, it is little more than a fragrant shield against the stench of sickness. The plague doctor enters your home without hurry. He carries a long wooden cane, not for walking, but for keeping distance, to lift your chin, to move your blanket, to poke at swollen lumps without touching you. He leans close to inspect you, though the glass lenses hide any expression. His voice is muffled through the mask. He asks questions your fevered mind struggles to answer. Since when have you had the swelling? Any bleeding from the gums? Your family hovers in the corner, hands clasped, eyes full of worry. The doctor opens a leather satchel, revealing an assortment of strange instruments, glass bottles of dark liquid, rolls of linen, small knives, and even leeches writhing in a jar. He decides to attempt treatment, bloodletting first, to balance the humors. He ties a strip of cloth tightly around your arm and uses a small blade to draw blood. The bowl beside the bed slowly fills with a deep crimson swirl, then he mixes a thick, bitter liquid in a wooden cup, a concoction of herbs, vinegar, and powdered minerals. It smells like something you'd use to clean a floor, but you drink it because he says it may draw out the illness. Afterwards, he burns a handful of rosemary and juniper in a small pot, waving the smoke around your bed in the belief it will chase away the pestilence. The scent is sharp and choking, but your mother watches hopefully. The treatment ends with the doctor's instructions: keep the windows open for fresh air. Boil all clothing, and prepare a warm poultice for your swellings. He leaves without a handshake, tapping his cane on the ground as he disappears down the street to his next patient. In the quiet that follows, you realize, the plague doctor is not here to heal so much as to witness. His presence is both a warning and a sign of finality, and you think back to the brutal surgery we spoke of earlier, the unwashed saws, the bleeding, the risk. Between that and this, it's clear, we would not last a day in their world. They say war changes everything, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, it changed the body most of all. Imagine the battlefield, not the tidy scenes from paintings, but a churn of mud, smoke, and human cries. Cannons belching iron. Muskets flashing. And behind the lines, in a tent that smelled of copper and rot, a surgeon stood with a saw, waiting. There was no waiting for infection to set in. There was no luxury of clean wounds. If a limb was shattered, and it often was, bone splintered like driftwood, the only choice was to cut it off, fast. Not for comfort, not even for certainty, but for the faintest hope of survival. The surgeons of the battlefield were not the slow, scholarly men of lecture halls. They were butchers in aprons, sleeves rolled to the elbow, steel glinting. The quicker the cut, the better the odds, and the record for an amputation: under 2 minutes. But speed came at a cost. The blade was rarely cleaned. The saw was shared between patients. And the patient, if lucky, got a swig of rum and a stick to bite. This was not cruelty. It was necessity. The noise was constant, not just gunfire, but the sharp crack of saw teeth, the grunt of effort, the hiss of breath through clenched teeth. Assistants held the patient down, two to a side, as the surgeon worked. There was no anesthesia yet, only the rush of adrenaline and the unbearable clarity of pain. In those moments, survival was a coin toss. Some men woke to find themselves alive and missing a leg. Others never woke at all. Many died not from the loss of the limb, but from the fever that followed, the invisible enemy of infection, and yet, by the standards of their time, these surgeons were heroes. A fast, decisive cut meant the difference between life and slow death. On battlefields like Waterloo, the pile of discarded limbs outside the surgery tent grew so high that orderlies had to drag them away by the cartload. It was the quiet aftermath of every victory and every defeat, if we, soft-skinned from antiseptic gels, wary of paper cuts, were dropped into that tent. We would last seconds before reeling out into the mud. The smell alone would break us. The sight would finish the rest, but those soldiers. They clenched their jaws and endured, because the choice was pain now or death tomorrow, and that is why we wouldn't last a day in their place, not just because of the surgery itself, but because we are strangers to the bargain they knew too well. To live, you must first survive the cut. The tent fell silent again, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of exhaustion. Moments ago, the air had been alive with the thud of boots, the rush of orderlies, and the sharp bark of commands. The surgeon had been at work for hours, moving from one patient to the next without pause, each operation blending into the next like chapters in a book no one wished to read. You might think the surgery itself was the hardest part. But in truth, survival came down to what happened after. Bandaged men lay in neat, rigid rows, each on a cot no wider than a door plank. The bandages were clean now, clean enough, but the eyes above them told another story. There was no morphine for days on end. Water had to be boiled and cooled before it could be given. And food? Mostly hard biscuits and thin soup. If you were lucky, the recovery ward was just another canvas tent. Flaps were rolled down to keep out the chill, but the air was heavy with damp wool and the faint sweetness of laudanum. Outside, you could still hear the distant thunder of cannon. Inside, there was the slower, steadier rhythm of breathing, punctuated by coughs, groans, and whispered prayers. The surgeon would visit each man in turn, checking bandages, touching foreheads to feel for fever. He had learned to smile in a way that was comforting without promising too much. For many, infection was still the enemy waiting just outside the tent flaps. There was a kind of unspoken camaraderie here, a fellowship forged not in battle, but in waiting. The man who'd lost an arm might help his neighbor lift a cup of water. Another would share his blanket with a boy barely old enough to shave. Letters from home were passed around like precious relics, and a story told once would be retold a dozen times until it became legend. Even so, recovery was rarely simple. The human body was stubborn, but so was the world outside. Winter seeped in through seams in the tent. Mud worked its way into boots and bedding. Supplies were delayed for days by flooded roads. And the war didn't wait for anyone to heal. Some men dreamed of home, of farms and workshops and quiet streets. Others could think only of returning to the fight, perhaps to settle a score, perhaps because it was the only life they knew. But all of them understood that their lives had been permanently redrawn, like maps after a war, and this was the brutal truth: surviving the surgeon's table was only the first battle. The weeks that followed demanded a different kind of courage, the courage to endure. To learn to live again with fewer tools than you were born with, to look in the mirror and see someone you hadn't met before. Still, there was light in the gloom. A nurse's quiet humming as she washed a patient's face. The smell of fresh bread brought by a passing supply wagon. The first time someone managed to walk, or hobble, to the tent flap on their own. Small victories counted here. They were all anyone had. In the end, survival wasn't about going back to who you were. It was about becoming someone new, forged in the same fire that had nearly consumed you. The surgeon had done his work, or at least, the part of it that could be done. You'd been stitched, bandaged, and sent home with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The worst was over. Or so you thought. But in the 18th century, the day after an operation was often when the real danger began. It's morning. You wake in your bed, though wake is perhaps too generous a word. Your body has not rested so much as shivered and sweated through the hours, shifting between shallow dozing and sharp, jarring moments of pain. The bandage at the stump of your leg is soaked through. Not with fresh, bright blood, that would almost be reassuring, but with a watery, pink-tinged seep that smells faintly wrong. You remember the surgeon's hands, the table, the saw. You try not to think about it, but the memory has already burrowed in. By the second day, the fever begins to bloom. It is not the kind of fever that comes with a winter cold. This is heat that feels alive, like a second, cruel heart pumping through your body. Your head throbs. Every sound, a cart rolling down the street, the clink of a teacup, seems amplified. You're sweating, but your fingers feel icy. Family members hover, worried but also helpless. There's no ice to bring down your temperature, no antibiotics to chase away infection. Instead, you are given a cloth soaked in vinegar to wipe your face, or perhaps a sip of weak broth. The delirium sets in by evening. The walls seem to sway. Shadows stretch and shrink in impossible ways. The people who tend to you speak in sentences you can't quite follow, their words slipping like water through your grasp. At one moment, you think you hear the surgeon's voice again, hold him steady, but it's just your neighbor's wife asking if you'd like more broth. In the 18th century, a large proportion of surgical patients did not die on the table. They died here, in bed, days later. The surgeon's part was over, the body's war with infection had only begun. Sometimes the wound would take on a dark, angry hue, the edges swelling and the flesh going soft. Other times, the infection would move inward silently, the blood itself turning poisonous. This was called septicemia. Though most patients never learned the word, there was no reliable cure. If the fever didn't break within a few days, it usually meant the infection was winning. You might be bled again, in the belief that draining your body of bad humors would help. Or perhaps blistered, hot plasters applied to raise bubbles on the skin, thought to draw out sickness. These treatments could weaken you even further. By the third day, you drift between worlds. Memories blur with strange visions, a lantern swinging above your head, a ship you've never been on, the smell of freshly sawn wood. You don't remember eating, but sometimes you wake with a faint taste of honey in your mouth, someone having coaxed a spoonful past your lips. If you are lucky, truly, astonishingly lucky, the fever will recede. The stump will begin to close, and the body will slowly knit itself back together. You will walk, or rather, limp, into the next chapter of your life, forever changed. If you are not lucky, the fever will deepen. Your breathing will slow, and your family will know before you do that the surgeon's victory was only temporary. In the 18th century, the brutality of surgery didn't end with the saw or the stitch. The pain followed you home, the fever came uninvited, and the infection. The infection was always waiting. Survival wasn't just a matter of enduring the operation. It was a matter of enduring the long, uncertain days afterward, and many did not. It was the quiet that haunted you most. The morning after the worst of the surgeries, the recovery tent was a different kind of battlefield. There were no musket cracks, no cannon blasts, no shouts of charge or retreat, only the shuffle of boots, the soft clink of tin cups, and the low murmur of nurses checking for breathing that might have stopped in the night. For some, the fever had already set in. Sweat poured from flushed foreheads as the body waged war against invisible enemies it didn't understand. Infection, a word that meant little back then, was already at work. You could smell it before you could see it, a sour, sickly odor that seemed to cling to the canvas walls. Others drifted in and out of delirium, calling for mothers, sweethearts, or comrades who weren't there anymore. And for some, there was only stillness, the body having spent the last of its fight in the small hours before dawn. It's here, in this aftermath, that the final truth of surgery in the 18th century becomes clear: it was only the beginning of a patient's trial. And it's here that we can draw the sharpest contrast to the modern world we know today. In the tent, the surgeon's saw, once warm from hours of work, now lay cooling on the table, flecks of dried brown still clinging to the teeth. Beside it, a roll of linen bandages, some clean, some not, waited for reuse. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and the wax from guttering candles. Fast forward to a modern operating room. The saw is gone, replaced by precision instruments sealed in sterile packets. The air smells faintly of antiseptic, not battle. Gloves snap onto hands that will never touch a patient without protection. Stainless steel gleams under bright, shadowless light. Here, the patient will not wake screaming mid-procedure. In the 18th century, the best you could hope for was a bottle of rum, a leather strap to bite down on, and a few strong men to hold you still. Pain was not avoided, it was endured. The shock alone could kill a man as surely as a musket ball. Today, anesthesia is a given. The patient drifts away before the first incision and wakes hours later, the pain managed, the trauma largely hidden. That invisible mercy, to never see or feel the worst of what's being done to save you, would have been beyond imagining for a soldier in that old recovery tent. In the past, no one spoke of bacteria. No one boiled instruments unless it was to soften resin on the handles. Bandages were reused. And the surgeon's apron was often a badge of experience, stained with the work of many operations. Infections cut men down by the dozen, and fevers ran high until they burned out or burned through. Now, sterile fields, autoclaves, and antibiotics stand guard against the smallest killers. Wounds are cleaned with precision. Lines deliver targeted medication. The invisible enemies that once roamed unchecked now face an army of their own. In the tent, there was no real question of whether the operation should happen. The surgeon decided, sometimes within seconds, whether a limb was worth saving. The patient's voice, if he still had the strength to speak, was rarely the deciding factor. Today, informed consent is a foundation of medical practice. Risks, benefits, and alternatives are explained. The patient, or their family, chooses the path forward. That sense of agency is a luxury born of peace, of time, and of the systems we've built to protect it. In the 18th century, if you survived, you carried your scars, and your nightmares, alone. Night terrors, sudden fits of anger, or deep melancholy were considered personal burdens, not medical conditions. The mind was not yet a battlefield anyone sought to treat. Now, post-traumatic stress is recognized, named, and treated. Therapy, medication, and rehabilitation programs try to give the survivor more than just a healed wound. They aim to restore a whole person. The recovery tent was cold in winter and stifling in summer. Supplies came when they could. Food was simple and often sparse. Comfort was whatever a comrade could spare, a blanket, a story, a piece of bread. Today, recovery rooms are climate-controlled, meals tailored to nutrition needs, and nurses' stations hum with quiet efficiency. It's a setting built for healing, not merely surviving. In the 18th century, amputation survival rates were grim, sometimes as low as 25% in battlefield conditions. Even those who lived often lost their lives later to infection. In modern hospitals, survival rates for similar procedures exceed 95%, and long-term health outcomes are vastly improved. These numbers are more than statistics. They are the sum of every small advancement, every painful lesson, every life lost that taught us how to save the next one. The contrast is clear, but it came at a price. Every antiseptic, every anesthesia protocol, every sterile technique, all of it was learned through centuries of trial, error, and loss. The suffering in that 18th century tent is part of the foundation of the survival we take for granted today. It's tempting to imagine stepping into the past with your modern resilience, but the truth is stark. Without vaccines, antibiotics, anesthesia, or even proper wound care, most of us wouldn't last long after a serious injury. Our bodies, and expectations, are shaped by modern safety nets. Remove them, and the world becomes far sharper, far more unforgiving. So we leave the tent, the surgeon's saw resting beside a folded bandage, the window open to a windswept, gray sky. Loss is in the air, but so is something else, the stubborn persistence to go on. The same will that drove a fevered soldier to survive in 1790 is alive in the patient recovering from surgery today, and perhaps that's the real bridge between their world and ours. Survival is still survival. No matter the century, the saw rests now in silence, its edge dulled not by time, but by the weight of memory. Beside it, a bandage, stained, folded, whispers of pain endured and lives forever changed. Outside, the wind moves through the open window, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and the promise of another day. In this quiet, loss and endurance sit side by side. And the story drifts into history, where it will remain, waiting to be remembered. Another whisper from the past, now fading into the night. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more sleepy stories from history. And until next time,